hear the left talk, getting rid of FEMA would be an abdication of responsibility. It'd be, the end of the United States as we know it. Of course, I say that about just about every single government agency. Joining now to decide whether that's true is Mark Meckler, co-founder and president of Convention of States Action. Mark, nice to have you back.
Always good to be with you, Steve.
So as the Trump administration pares back on these different agencies and departments and so forth, to me, it looks like it's responsible to trim back the spending. We've got redundancy and overspending and bloat and all of this. And we've seen, obviously, DOJ found billions of dollars in wasteful spending and fraud and abuse. What about FEMA? Somehow we survived the earthquake of 1906 and other great cataclysmic events in American history without FEMA. How did we do it?
Yeah, we did it because the states did what they're supposed to do, which is they are sovereign entities and they're supposed to take care of their own people. And actually, responding in an emergency is one of the fundamental things that government is supposed to do. And the more local, the better. If you have an emergency in your town should respond. If your town can't handle it, maybe your county, and then maybe your state. But the federal government should not be responding to localized emergencies.
And what is I'll use that earthquake in San Francisco in 1906. Pretty good example. Most people have at least heard of it. Giant, devastating earthquake. But it pretty much was limited to California. Should federal government respond to such a thing? Is there a role for federal government and state government to play on the same field?
No, I don't think so. And by the way, the framers of the Constitution didn't believe so. We know of the famous debate between Hamilton and Jefferson about big government versus small government. But a place where they both agreed, which was that if a state can do it, then the federal government can't, and vice versa. This is strictly the province of the states. And if states want to enter into mutual support agreements, which they do all the time, if they want to say, hey, we'll help you in an emergency if you help us in an emergency, that's the way that you get broader assistance if it's needed. We see this, for example, in California all the time. They have these huge wildfires, and firefighters from the surrounding states will come in through state agreements between the states. We don't need the federal government to intervene in that.
Plus, you get helps from the native tribes of America and Canada. You get Canadians that come in, smoke jumpers from Canada that come in. Good example from the forest fires. When did this all start to happen then? You look at FEMA. I know the EPA came in by executive order by the administration of Richard Nixon back in the early 70s. But where did FEMA come from and when and under whose directive and under whose constitutional authority? I'll ask you that, Mark.
Yeah, I think you're hitting the key issue is under whose constitutional or what constitutional authority. And the answer is it's authority that was created out of thin air by the Supreme Court under what we call the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause was supposed to give the federal government the power to regulate interstate commerce. Back then, what they meant was to smooth out the shipment of goods between states. That's been expanded radically since the 1930s to give the federal government the power to regulate or be involved in almost anything they want. Examples include, as you said, FEMA, but it's also the EPA, energy, education. These are things for which the federal government has no constitutional authority other than that invented out of thin air by the Supreme Court.
So one of those things, I believe, is the Chevron doctrine that you're referring to. And the Chevron doctrine got its wings clipped pretty good here last year in June when the Supreme Court was handing out decisions, right? It pared back a lot of that power. The Supreme Court today is on the right path to clean this mess up, but will they get there?
Yeah, I think the answer is clearly they won't get there. And here's why I say that. The Chevron doctrine was a doctrine that just said that if an agency promulgates a regulation, it's up to the agency to interpret that regulation. The courts don't really have much of a role. It was called Chevron deference. In other words, they would defer to the interpretations of the agency no matter how ridiculous. So they got rid of that doctrine. What they didn't do is get rid of the agencies themselves. There's no authority for these agencies. And even among the most strident conservatives on the Supreme Court, I don't think there is an appetite to really limit the Commerce Clause doctrine. So I just don't think we're going to see the courts do that for us.
So that leaves us with these agencies that were also created. Look, the EPA, created by executive order, is maybe one of the most egregious examples of creating an agency that is now funded to the tens of billions of dollars. The bill handed the American taxpayers, and to what end? So they can attack my water supply, tell me they can regulate the mud puddle in the driveway of my farm. I mean, honestly, this is what these regulatory agencies would do because they've never seen a rule, a regulation, a bit of power that they turned their back on, have they?
They haven't. And I think one of the things that's so outrageous about this, Steve, is that your state, wherever you live, wherever I live here in Texas, we all have our own version of the EPA. Every state protects its own environment. And frankly, I think they do a much better job than the EPA because they're local folks who understand the environment. In some cases, for example, in California, the California Environmental Quality Agency is much more strict than the EPA. So I think it should be up to the states on a state-by-state basis. We certainly don't need the EPA, folks thousands of miles away in Washington, D.C., lording over us, telling us how we can or can't use our land. And then fundamentally and importantly, I believe that's still completely unconstitutional.
Yeah, let me ask you how this plays in something Donald Trump did here this past week, knocking down the California EV rules that would have mandated that California only be allowed to sell electric vehicles in 2035, 10 years, less than 10 years now. And 80% of the cars on the road had to be EVs as well. Well, that got knocked down because that was going to be extended to all the states. Again, that's a complete disruption of the constitutional order, is it not?
It is. We think we all know the doctrine of federalism, the idea that the states have individual power vis-a-vis the federal government, and that was supposed to be a balance. What most people aren't familiar with is something that California was practicing there, which we call cartelized federalism. In other words, what they do is they want stricter environmental laws, stricter regulations of all kinds. They get together with other blue states and they lobby the federal government to go along. And they also force these car companies or other big industrial concerns to manufacture according to California standards. The way they do that is California is the biggest market in the nation. It's very difficult to make cars for every individual market. So they make cars according to the toughest standards. Those are California standards. That allows California to impose their standards nationwide. And it's really good what Trump did, which is slap that down.
And that's just the latest example of trying to realign. But look, a lot of this stuff's been afoot for not just a couple of years or a couple of decades, but many decades. Yeah, you look at the Chevron doctrine and those sorts of things. These go back decades, as you say, to the 1930s. We can do some repair work in 3 or 4 years, but we can't get it all fixed, can we, Mark?
Again, I mean, there is no silver bullet. I think this is important. It goes back really about 115 years. The Supreme Court, about 115 years ago, really quits looking to the framers of the Constitution, original intent, and they start just giving us the interpretation of 9 people in black robes about what the Constitution means. This is a very difficult problem. The framers didn't anticipate this problem. In fact, what they thought was that the courts would be the weakest of the 3 branches of government. They had neither the sword nor the purse to enforce their rulings. They had no idea that eventually people would just take a knee before the Supreme Court and allow it to do whatever it wanted. So This is a problem that requires a fundamental structural fix. And I don't believe Washington, D.C. is going to do this by itself.
I don't believe so either. Mark Meckler, co-founder, president, Convention of States Action, DIY Nation, and so much more. Mark, thank you for being here. We have to leave it there for today, but it's a good conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
The greatest economic comeback in our country's history is just getting started. Joining me now to discuss more is the president of the Convention of the States, Mark Meckler. Mark, thank you for joining the Pulse this evening. What are your thoughts on these absolutely incredible numbers that President Trump is getting barely 4 months in to his second term?
Yeah, it shows that the American people like what they see. And the reason they like what they see, David, is because this is a president who believes in keeping his promises. If you go to his Domestic Policy Council in the White House, and I've been there, they say they are the office of promises kept. And that's what Donald Trump is doing. He's stepping up for the American people domestically, economically, internationally. And the American people can't believe it because an actual politician is doing what he actually said he was going to do.
Yeah, it's a pretty rare occasion. I don't know that I can remember, other than his first term when he tried to do a lot and was hamstrung at every chance by Congress and the liberals and the Democrats. But it sure seems like this time there's a lot different momentum that he has behind him. You know, a recent YouGov poll shows a 19-point net increase in support for President Trump among voters ages 18 to 29. How in the world is that? They called President Trump everything from a racist to a fascist in the mainstream media. And now there's a huge surge in support among young American voters. What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, I think these are some of the people who suffered the most under the Biden administration. Rents climbed 24% under the Biden administration, meaning literally if you had an apartment that was $1,000 a month. It's now $1,240 a month. People just can't afford to live. They can't afford to put gas in the tank. They can't afford to go out for drinks at a bar with their friends. And so these are the people that are struggling the most. They have the least faith in government. And Donald Trump is the least government-friendly president we've had in my lifetime. So they like him. They like what he's doing, and they believe that he's working for them.
Yeah, it can't hurt either that Trump shows up at UFC. You know, you've got everybody that's winning, that's giving their, homage and thanking President Trump, hopping over the fence. He hangs out with some pretty amazing people, and that crowd definitely sees it. What do you think? Why do you think there's such a divide in the country between people who support President Trump and all the old farts who spend their weekends protesting Tesla dealerships?
Yeah, it's really interesting, David. If you dig into the polling numbers, that's even where his support is weakest among Republicans, which is the oldest generation of Republicans. And I think they don't like his lack sometimes of gentility and just standards of politeness. But I think the younger you get, the more people know, look, they want a hands-on president. They want somebody who's going to upset the status quo, kick the table over, and do the things that are necessary to fix government. So I think that's what you see is people who are just, genteel in their politics, old school, blue blood Republicans. They might not like him so much, but the rest of the country, they like seeing the tables kicked over.
Yeah, I think they do. And I think they're probably still watching some of the old legacy media instead of watching my show or anybody else here on Newsmax. There's some other good news for President Trump. A new poll shows that his approval rating among Hispanic voters jumped 15 points in just the past month alone. He now has a 57% approval rating with Hispanic voters. Mark, Democrats thought that they had the Hispanic vote all wrapped up until the last few years. What do you think changed?
Yeah, there was a term or a phrase among Democrats, which was demographics is destiny, political destiny, they meant. What we see is a huge increasing Hispanic demographic in this country, and they're turning to President Trump, and specifically on his signature issues, which are the economy and border security. They like what they see in President Trump. They're voting for him in large numbers. And honestly, with this kind of a majority among Democrats, especially if Trump can transfer that to other Republicans, Democrats might spend a very long winter in the wilderness.
Yeah, well, I think they need to. I think the best shot there, Democrats are saying for House Committee Chair is Jasmine Crockett. I don't know how her and people like AOC and the squad wind up leading the Democrat Party, but it sure seems that they do. I want to switch gears for a minute here. I want to get your reaction to the president's message for Vladimir Putin today on True Social. He wrote, quotes, what Vladimir Putin doesn't realize is that if it wasn't for me, lots of really bad things would have already happened to Russia, and I mean really bad. He's playing with fire. How long can Putin afford to keep testing President Trump?
Well, hopefully not very long. I think, Trump's been very unbalanced in his approach to that conflict, and I understand why. He's been going after Ukraine and their president, Zelensky, and trying to bring him into line. And he has pretty much nowadays, if he says to do something, Zelensky jumps and does it. But if we're going to end this war, it's going to take Putin, and that's going to take some serious pressure. He is a tough cookie with a big country, and it's going to take President Trump putting him in the headlock and bringing him to the table if it's going to get done.
Yeah, I know there was stories out that there was a potential assassination attempt with a drone that was being blamed on Ukraine and Zelensky. Did anything ever come out of that actually proving that was the case? Is that maybe why some of the retaliatory actions that Putin has taken over the last week have taken place as well? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I haven't seen any proof about that, but I wouldn't be surprised. Obviously, Ukraine is fighting for its existence, and they need to fight hard if they're going to win. And the thing that Putin really can't afford is the U.S. to step in vigorously on the side of Ukraine and sort of let them use the weapons they want to use it. I saw today that the EU, the nations in Europe, have agreed to remove distance limitations on the weaponry they provide to Ukraine. That means Moscow is now a target. Major Russian cities are now targets. So I think this thing's going to open wide up if Putin doesn't step in line.
So do you think that there's still a possible agreement for peace that can take place between Ukraine and Russia?
I do. I think it's probably going to come, and it's going to come from us putting more pressure on Russia. I think that means militarily, not that we're going to get involved or put boots on the ground. So we're just going to continue the flow of arms to Ukraine. We're going to allow them to use them the way they want. Putin is a smart guy, and he's taken territory. He's got pretty much what he wanted at the beginning of the war. I think what we're going to see is a status quo settlement. They're going to probably get to keep the territory that they already have, and Ukraine's going to get some security guarantees, and I think we'll see status quo for a while to come in the future when this thing ends.
Now, what about if America was to just pull out of the Ukraine war altogether? Do you think Russia could just completely take over?
That would be up to the Europeans, though. If we pulled out immediately, the Europeans cannot provide the kind of armaments that the United States can, and likely Ukraine would collapse. If we pulled out slowly, the Europeans seem to be getting more serious about Ukrainian defense, Germany, especially Poland as well. That means they might be able to fill the gap, but it would take some time. If we pulled out altogether, I'm pretty sure that the tanks would roll and they'd end up in Kyiv, and that would be that.
Yeah, it sure seems like it. And I'm sure Zelensky knows that, and hopefully that's exactly why he's listening to our commander-in-chief like it seems like he is. Mark Meckler, appreciate your insights, sir. Thank you for joining the
How is this system working? And how do we make changes to this system if this is a system I got to fight through? At least I know that how the system works. There's folks that come into Congress have no clue that this is how the system works. So how do we reset and reorganize ourselves if the only way we're resetting or reorganizing is over the same systems that are now legally enshrined in our Constitution for us to be able to move forward to conduct foreign and domestic policy?
I think you're addressing something really important, and it's what I've dedicated my life to now, which is it's not about who's running for Congress. I say to people, you think we have a personnel problem in Congress. Of course, we should always try to elect the best people we possibly can, but it's not a personnel problem. We have a structure problem, and our structure is now designed to run exactly the way you see. It's not broken in the sense that there are people who've designed it this way. They like it this way. It works for them. It works for the people in power. And so it's operating just fine according to them. It's broken for the American people. This is part of the reason that I am doing what I'm doing, because I don't think we can fix our government without the structural reforms. So one of the things that would address what you're talking about, there's a whole bunch of them, honestly, but one of them is that we absolutely should have some form of term limits. And people talk about term limits for Congress. I like that. I could be a fan of that. I say could be because if you have term limits for Congress, but don't limit the terms for the staffers and the bureaucrats, then all you do is make the staffers and the bureaucrats more powerful. And so there's a lot of people running around out there, in my opinion, unwisely saying term limits for Congress. And I'm saying, watch out what you wish for, because you might get that. And then all you're going to do is empower the deep state in a way that we're all already aware of and afraid of and don't like right now. So we have to be really careful on term limits. There are other things that I think are really important. Part of what you're describing is that this is how the lobby likes it to work. The lobbyists are the people with a lot of power in Washington, D.C. They like that schedule that you just described. It works for them. They have influence throughout that whole process. A huge amount of the lobbyists that are in Washington, D.C. have worked for the government previously. In fact, this week, we just saw the most high-profile case in history. Second in command, Navy Admiral, got convicted of bribery, literally, because he was in the Navy. He was directing contracts to a company that he was going to go get a job with afterwards, making $500,000 a year. I think we need to, by constitutional amendment, make it illegal to lobby the federal government if you've ever worked for the federal government. I think it should be a lifetime ban. Working for the government should be public service. I don't mind that they get paid well. Frankly, in some cases, I think they should be paid more than they're currently paid, but it shouldn't be a way for them to get rich after they come out of government. So I think that's another thing we need to do. Lifetime ban on lobbying the government. And then inside the parties, this is where the electoral part comes. We have to focus on structural reforms inside the parties. We have to elect people that are going to break the system that you just described. And we also have to understand who our enemy is in that fight. You described the way the left operates versus the right. Folks on the right are going to have to get a lot wiser. They're going to have to choose and support their candidates earlier. We're going to continue to run into the buzzsaw that you just described, the bias that's built into the system.